class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 1 of the preseason for the San Jose Sharks, in which they took on the defending Stanley Cup champions Vegas Golden Knights and won by a score of 5-2. The preseason is sort of in a weird, awkward limbo position here, where it is honestly a bit more similar to the rookie face-off tournament we saw last week than it is to the actual NHL regular season that is upcoming in about 2 weeks. And this is for a multitude of reasons, the first of which is that results don't really mean much during the preseason. One of my favorite examples of the past few years was back in, I believe, the 16-17 season. The Colorado Avalanche had a perfect preseason, 6-0 record, and yet going into the regular season, they ended up putting up one of the worst regular seasons in recent history with just 48 points through 82 games. To put that into perspective, the last place team from this past season, 22-23, was the Anaheim Ducks, a pretty bad team, and they still managed to get 58 points, 10 more than Colorado got that year. And so whether you have a perfect 6-0 preseason or a terrible 0-6 preseason, there is zero correlation with how you're actually going to do through the regular season. You see, the NHL tries to make these games at least somewhat interesting by mandating teams run a certain amount of veteran players in their lineup. I believe that number is 8. But the thing is that because the results don't actually matter, the veteran players aren't exactly super self-motivated to do well, especially when you consider that the other half of the lineup is usually filled with younger players who are trying to earn a spot in the lineup. And so you end up with this strange imbalance where half the team is trying their hardest while the other half is kind of just skating around. You take a look at a player like Tomas Hertl, who could possibly have the worst possible game ever in his entire career during the preseason, and yet he would still be penciled into a top 6 spot come the start of the regular season because it really just doesn't matter. And even some of the newer faces on the San Jose Sharks who you would think would be looking to make a good first impression, like Duclair or Hoffman or Jan Ruda, are still not exactly super motivated to try their hardest in these preseason games. And so it does create this sort of weird type of feeling in a game where you're getting the sense that certain players aren't exactly trying their hardest, which definitely makes sense with the stakes being so low in these types of games. You see, in the regular season, how the game actually ends up going doesn't really matter as long as you end up getting the 2 points at the end of the day. So whether or not you get completely outshot or you dominate the game, as long as it is resulting in 2 points, you're happy, and if it results in 0 points, you're pretty sad. While in the preseason, if there is no point totals, there's no standings, and so the only thing you're getting out of these games is watching how specific players do, and that usually comes down to those younger players. On top of that, another reason the preseason isn't super helpful is because of the fact that teams will dress rosters of very, very different levels of play. So if we take a look at the two teams here tonight, the Sharks, the 4th last place team from this past season, and the Vegas Golden Knights, the Stanley Cup champions from this past season, you would think Vegas would have the advantage in this game, but you take a look at the lineups, the Sharks are coming in with a top 6 that isn't exactly what they might be running next season. Of course, there is no Logan Couture here tonight, but it is relatively close to what we might actually see. With Bordelot swapped out for Couture, that's pretty basic. Meanwhile, the Vegas Golden Knights, from a forward standpoint, their best forward tonight was Ivan Barbashev. There was no Jack Eichel, no Mark Stone, no Jonathan Marchessault. And so the tables are essentially flipped here, where while the Vegas Golden Knights as a whole roster would be better, the players who they iced here tonight were significantly worse than the Sharks. And so it makes this for a very uncompetitive, sort of unfair type of game, where it is not that much of a surprise that the Sharks ended up winning this one. But with all that being said, it is still a decent thing to look at, like with the rookie face-off tournament, because you do indeed want to see at least how some of the younger players are performing. And of course, even in this particular case, while some of the veterans aren't going to be giving the most inspired performances, like I mentioned earlier, there are some first impressions that were still pretty interesting to see. So let's us take a look at the first line here and immediately start off with a player who had a big spotlight on them for tonight's game, and that is Filip Zadina. Was left Detroit last season looking to prove himself on a completely new team, completely new scenery. He comes in here to San Jose, immediately thrusted onto the first line, at least for the preseason, to see what he can do. And it was honestly a decent game for Zadina. Probably didn't shine as much as many people may have been hoping for. His power play performance was pretty good, and the Sharks did get a decent chunk of power plays here tonight. His even strength performance had a couple of solid plays, but nothing super impressive. A decent start, I would say, to the preseason, where you're hoping Zadina can prove himself so he can try to lock down a top 6 spot going into the actual start of the year. When it comes to Tomas Hertl, obviously not a ton to say here. Was this a great game? No. Was this a bad game? No. Does it really matter? Also no. And so not really much to say. When it comes to the third player on this line, though, Mike Hoffman, while he does have that same veteran status as Tomas Hertl, he is at least slightly more interesting to look at because he is a new player with the San Jose Sharks. And when it comes to Hoffman, he came very much as advertised on the offensive side of things. A very good power play specialist, showed off a really nice shot, some strong one-timer, or in particular one strong one-timer on the power plays in the early parts of this game when the Sharks were getting multiple of them. At even strength, his offensive play wasn't amazing, but the one thing that did catch me by surprise when it came to Hoffman was actually his defensive play. Now, he was advertised as a really bad defensive player, not just like kind of bad, but like actively awful, making your team worse when playing in the defensive zone. But Hoffman kind of surprised me a bit in this game, looked much more solid than I thought, and obviously the competition was significantly weaker than in most NHL games because the Golden Knights were not icing a very competitive lineup. But there were some moments where Hoffman really stood out in a good way. There was this particular back check in the second period that if you had told me Hoffman had made that, I would have never believed you. So maybe that is actually a good telling thing going into this NHL regular season, that we might actually get a full-on consistent effort from Hoffman, which is not only going to be good from a Sharks standpoint, but it should also be remembered that there is 1 year remaining on Hoffman's contract, making him a potentially valuable asset to be traded near the trade deadline. When it comes to the second line, we had Barabanov, who had a bit of a rough start to this game. In fact, I would say the first 30 minutes he was really bad, but definitely picked it up as it went on. A very nice assist on the Kyle Burroughs goal, and generally had a decent finish to this game. The other winger on this one was Duclair, also looking to make a decent first impression. The skill level for Duclair was very clearly there. Had a few moments in this game where you're like, damn, that is a really good player, but it really didn't all come together, which just felt like a bit of a lack of motivation here in this preseason game. So definitely good enough to obviously make the Sharks lineup coming out of the preseason be in the top 6 for the San Jose Sharks, and a few of the plays he made did inspire hope that that could lead to some good things for the Sharks. Really the most interesting player here on this line, like where it was with Zadina on the first line, is of course Thomas Bordeleau, who I thought had a very, very steady game. Now, this isn't the type of game that at the end of it you were going, wow, Bordeleau stood out in such a hugely positive way. It's not as though that second rookie face-off tournament game where Bordeleau had, I believe, 3 points, 2 goals, 1 assist. One of the goals was really, really nice. Nothing of that nature, but Bordeleau I thought played a very steady, reliable type of game, which is something that I mentioned is very, very important for NHL coaches. They want to know that they can trust you when you're on the ice, and I thought Bordeleau did a very good job, especially as a sort of center from the defensive standpoint. You want to be that third man back when you are playing center, especially in the top 6 where you are going to be facing off against some pretty tough competition. Obviously not the case here tonight, but if you were to play in this particular role going into the actual season, that would indeed be the case. And I thought while Bordeleau didn't shine offensively all that much in this game, at least not at even strength, there were some solid defensive plays that makes it honestly a pretty good game for number 17. When it comes to the third line, we have Danil Gushin here, who was the tale of two games, I would say. From the power play standpoint, I thought Gushin was really, really solid, one of the better looking players from the Sharks power play, but from an even strength standpoint, this line didn't really get a ton rolling. Gushin had a couple of decent defensive plays, but offensively at even strength, not really able to accomplish much on this line. And the same would go with the two other players here. Tristan Robbins was honestly pretty much invisible throughout most of this game. He did draw a penalty at some point, but otherwise didn't really do much. And then Todd here, he did score a goal, and a very nice goal, as the Golden Knights completely lost zone coverage and he was left all alone in front of the net. And honestly, he had an okay game. He's kind of like the Kyle Criscuolo or the Agazino from last season, these older, more AHL veteran types of players who are getting a look here with the NHL squad in the preseason, but will likely be more consistent guys at the AHL level. Todd, definitely one of those players. When it comes to the fourth line, we had Giovanni Smith, another newcomer to this team, and Smith was honestly pretty impressive, at least sort of relative to what you would expect from him as a fourth line kind of physical player. I liked Smith a couple of moments. There was this really great chance that he had, I believe, back in the first period where he almost scored, and it was actually a pretty skilled play from him. He did take a penalty in the third period off of a big hit, which was relatively ill-advised, but it did show off the sort of strength that he has as a player. So I was relatively happy with Smith's performance here tonight. When it comes to Castles, kind of in the same situation as Todd on that third line, very much an AHL type of geared player who gets an opportunity in this preseason game. And then when it comes to Weisblatt, I thought he continued to show some solid tools in his game, I would say, but we also saw how difficult it can be to actually succeed at the NHL level. Even in the preseason, there was this one particular moment where he was having this battle with Brayden McNabb, one of the few actual decent NHL players in the lineup for the Vegas Golden Knights in this particular game, and he kind of went into this race for the puck type of battle with McNabb and essentially just bounced right off of him. He's just, while he is strong and a physical type of player, he's also a bit of a small player compared to Brayden McNabb's huge size. And so generally, those are going to be battles that are going to be tough for Weisblatt to win. And so he has to try and succeed in other ways. And that's going to be something to work on for this season because he is unlikely to really make the team out of training camp / preseason. When it comes to defensively, obviously the player stealing the show offensively was Henry Thrun. Scored very early on in this game, then added a second goal as well as a very nice assist to cap off a 3-point first period, which eventually was a 3-point game. And like I mentioned, offensively very, very good. It seems as though those few games that he played with Erik Karlsson had a strong effect on the offensive play of Henry Thrun, but at the same time seemed to have a strong effect on the defensive play of Henry Thrun. Because while this might not be the most popular opinion of the night, I personally felt as though Thrun in his own defensive zone really struggled at times in this game. He was thrust into a position of playing a good amount of ice time. He is a player who has aspirations of being a top 4 defenseman for the San Jose Sharks going into this next season. And defensively, even against a weak Golden Knights roster, it was relatively shaky. He seemed to have pucks bouncing off of his stick. He was going for some no-look clears that were just very ill-advised, passing in terrible positions in the defensive zone. So honestly, not a great game defensively for Henry Thrun, even though it was a very strong game offensively from him. So hopefully that's going to be something that he can clean up. He'll likely get multiple other opportunities in this preseason to actually shore up his game, because if he does want to be a player playing in the NHL regular season on a consistent basis, those are the types of things that need to improve. And when it comes to his defensive partner, Ruda, yet another newcomer to the San Jose Sharks this season, Ruda was not super noticeable, which of course for a defensive defenseman is a good thing. It should be noted that Ruda did have time on the Sharks' second power play unit after Thrun was the main guy on the Sharks' first power play unit. And while Thrun clearly upstaged him in that particular role, Ruda was not terrible, I would say. And then of course at even strength, like I mentioned, defensively, quite solid. When it comes to the second pairing, we have Okhotiuk, who was, to me, a bit of a throwaway player in the Timo Meier trade with the New Jersey Devils. You know, obviously there were the big names picked up like Shakir Mukhamadullin, a first-round pick. Even Fabian Zetterlund was an interesting name. Okhotiuk seemed to be just a kind of AHL defenseman throw-in, but in tonight's game, we finally got an opportunity to see him with the San Jose Sharks, even if it was in the preseason. And I thought it was a bit of a tale of of 2 games when it comes to him. I would say about half of his shifts, he was making all the right choices, smart plays, very simple, strong physically, looked really, really good. And then the other half of shifts, it felt as though he was either holding the puck for too long and getting it taken away from him, or not holding the puck enough and just making the incorrect call. So he seemed to be a player who needed to get his timings down a bit and be a bit smarter consistently, but he definitely had a strong tool set to make me think that perhaps he could be an NHL defenseman at some point down the line. Obviously not this season, but perhaps within the next couple of years. He was joined by Gannon Larocque on the second defensive pairing, a player who had an up and down but all around solid rookie faceoff tournament with the San Jose Sharks, and here tonight, not extremely noticeable, a bit of a slow start to this game, but ramped up, I would say, as it went on, and generally ended up with an okay but not super amazing, let's say 5 on 10, maybe 6 on 10 type of performance. And then when it comes to the final pairing here, Kyle Burroughs, yet another newcomer for the San Jose Sharks this season. Mike Grier was hard at work this offseason to bring in a whole new crop of players, and Burroughs, like I said, was one of them, and he had a very strong game, I would say, defensively for the San Jose Sharks. Also had a very nice goal off of that great pass from Barabanov, but defensively, very solid, strong type of player, the very type of player that you are not surprised that Mike Grier would target and bring over to San Jose, because it very much fits into the mold of the type of player that he wants. So that was pretty good to see. And he was joined by Jake Furlong, a player who we also saw during the rookie faceoff tournament, who had a strong start to that tournament, then fell off and continued to fall off, as this was a very weak game for Furlong. It honestly wouldn't surprise me to have this be the only preseason game that Furlong actually gets, and that he quickly ends up getting cut from training camp, sent back to juniors, because clearly there is a lot of, not a lot, but there is some raw talent there, but he's not really ready to actually be an NHL player at all. And then when it comes to the goaltender here, it was Kaapo Kähkönen getting the start tonight. A pretty solid performance from him. Wasn't tested a lot early on, but the amount of chances that the Golden Knights got ramped up as the game went on. Like I mentioned earlier, a lot of the actual really good players for the Golden Knights were not playing here tonight, so you weren't exactly facing off against the cream of the crop in terms of offensive talent, so it wasn't as though this was a difficult game competitively for Kaapo Kähkönen, but at least a decent enough start to the season for him, and that is, a very good thing, considering his confidence was likely absolutely shot after one of the worst seasons that we have seen from a goaltender in San Jose Sharks in a while last season. So I guess that is indeed a positive, but that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Tuesday with yet another preseason game, likely to have an extremely different lineup than what we saw here tonight, likely with a couple of players still managing to play a second straight game, and we shall see how that one goes. Class dismissed.